I'm Hassan Giordano, and this is your Annapolis Report. This week's Annapolis Report, we talk about the inauguration of Governor Larry Hogan and Lieutenant Governor Boyd Rutherford, who were sworn in to their second term as the state's executive leaders. The Republican administration, which was the first time their party has seen their governor reelected since 1954, put forth a remarkable and memorable ceremony, from the inaugural address in Annapolis to the inaugural ball later that evening at MGM Casino in Prince George's County. The 62-year-old Hogan, who was also the 62nd governor of the great state of Maryland, took the oath of office after being introduced by another historical governor, former Florida Governor Jeb Bush, which raised eyebrows and caused political analysts to speculate about what the anti-Trump Republicans may do in the 2020 presidential elections. Bush, who himself was the first Republican ever reelected as the governor of the Sunshine State, which is a key and critical state as it relates to the Electoral College and the pathway to victory for any presidential candidate, is said to be testing the waters for a possible primary challenge to sitting Republican Governor Donald Trump. Hogan has also been a fierce critic of this president, and along with Bush, with Hogan's approval ratings inching closer to 80%, would make a remarkable team if they do decide to put together a ticket in 2020. This possible run would not affect Governor Hogan's gubernatorial term, however, unless, of course, they both won the primary and the general elections in 2020, leaving the state's office vacant to be filled by current Lieutenant Governor Boyd Rutherford, who himself became the first Republican lieutenant governor to win re-election in the great state of Maryland. Rutherford, a 61-year-old Howard County resident, is said to be gearing up for his own run for the governor's mansion in 2022 and has been more visible all across the state of Maryland over the past year. But as it relates to the new term that they are focused on here in the great state of Maryland over the next 4 years, this past week's inaugural address, along with the proposed fiscal year 2020 budget that was put forth on Friday, highlighted some key agenda items for the Republican administration. As he did 4 years ago in his address, Governor Hogan promised to work hand in hand with the state's Democratic leadership that oversees both the House and the Senate by margins that can override any possible veto put forth by the Hogan administration. One such issue that may lead to a gubernatorial veto is that of the proposed $15 minimum wage increase here in the great state of Maryland, sponsored by Senator Cory McCray of Baltimore City and Delegate Diana Fennell of Prince George's County, and supported by more than 70 members of the 141-member Maryland General Assembly, including the 50-plus members of the Legislative Black Caucus. And while a bill has yet to surface, details of the pending legislation came out this week as members of the Fight for 15 coalition held a press conference and rally in Annapolis detailing the specifics of the bill and laying out amendments that they are unlikely to consider. Led by SEIU 1199 political director Ricara Jones, along with a host of unions and progressive groups in favor of this legislation, the group laid out and articulated a comprehensive piece of legislation that would increase the current $10.10 minimum wage to $15 by increasing it to $11 by the end of this year and increasing it $1 every year through 2023, and then tying future increases into the cost of living thereafter, ensuring that they wouldn't have to continue to go back and forth to the legislature for future increases. Jones stated that if you work full-time, you shouldn't have to make impossible choices between paying your rent, paying your BG&E bill, putting food on the table, or buying school supplies for your children. She alluded to citizens living in one of the wealthiest states of the country that they should not have 80% of its electorate living paycheck to paycheck. This sentiment was backed by the influential Speaker of the House, Michael Bush, who told DMV Daily that it is unconscionable that citizens in a wealthy state like Maryland continue to try to make ends meet. He said that this will be a priority for the House over the next 4 years, while Senate President Thomas Mike Miller said that the increase will happen regardless of opposing interests and will probably pass during this session. Now remember, Miller, who had once suggested a regional approach to increasing the minimum wage, seems to now embrace the statewide approach being pushed by legislative leaders who have made it clear that they will not accept any such amendments to their bill. However, Governor Hogan joined members of the business community, including the Maryland Chamber of Commerce, in questioning the effect this bill will have not only on businesses, and especially small business owners, but the economy as a whole. Hogan said that while it sounds good in theory, without any real thorough discussion or a detailed impact report, he questioned whether the passage of such a bill would help or hurt Maryland's economy. Will it help or hurt those that are truly in need, stated the second-term governor. Raising the minimum wage would put Maryland at a disadvantage, according to Governor Hogan, for attracting or retaining businesses who will now question whether operating under such a wage is worth the price of doing business here in the state of Maryland, or simply moving to a neighboring state such as Virginia, whose minimum wage remains at $7.25 an hour. Hogan stated that the state's economy is moving in a positive direction and that he wouldn't want to reverse such progress by possibly chasing businesses away, because it's now the cost of doing business will not allow them to balance their books like it would in neighboring states. The governor pointed to neighboring jurisdictions such as Pennsylvania, whose minimum wage is equal to that of Virginia's at $7.25 an hour, along with Delaware and West Virginia, whose minimum wage is currently set at $8.75 an hour, though Delaware's wage is set to increase to $9.25 an hour later this year, though that is less than Maryland's current minimum wage at $10.10 and $5.75 less than what was currently being proposed. In fact, the only neighboring jurisdiction comparable to the $15 an hour rate currently being sought is that of the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., whose $13.25 minimum wage is one of the highest in the nation and set to increase to $14 later this summer. So as you can see, this will certainly be a hotly debated bill this session. The other big bill to be introduced this past week was that of the budget, which is required to be introduced by the governor to the members of the legislature by the 10th day of the start of the legislative session. This past Friday, on that 10th day, the governor briefed members of the legislature on his proposed $46.6 billion budget bill, which was hailed by both parties for its increase in funding for public education, as well as its funding for opiate addiction, public safety, and a 3% raise to all state employees. And while Senate President Miller hailed the governor's plan as very positive, with House Appropriations Chairwoman and frequent Hogan critic, Delegate Maggie McIntosh, touting it as a great document for education, health, and public safety, it never fails to see members of the opposite party who always have something negative to say about the opposing party's legislation, regardless of the merits or how well it was received. Members such as Montgomery County Delegate Eric Luke took to social media and the media itself to criticize the governor's budgets, stating that the governor, who is the most popular governor in the nation currently, seems to always be quick to take credit for what Democrats have forced him to do. He referenced the recently passed lockbox bill and other pieces of legislation passed by Democrats over the past 4 years under the Hogan reign that forced him to put more money into education, including the funding formula implemented through Thornton years ago. And while the governor continues to tout that his administration has consistently made historic increases to education each year of his administration, including in the latest budget, this delegate feels as if the governor has had no choice but to do so because of Democrats. However, the state's funding formula could have called for an $11 million decrease in the aid for Baltimore City Public Schools. However, the governor chose to continue the city's school funding levels equitable to that of last year's funding, making it the second largest funded jurisdiction in the state of Maryland as it relates to school funding, behind only that of Somerset County, which is the state's poorest jurisdiction. Education spending in the operating budget totaled $6.9 billion, and the governor has included more than $438 million for school construction projects. One glaring difference in funding that Democrats will look to fully fund this year is the first year of proposals set forth by the Kerwin Commission, which had recommended a series of proposals and increased funding to pay for these proposals, such as overhauling school curriculums, increasing professional standards for teachers, and expanding pre-K. This would cost upwards of $3.8 billion a year. However, while they suggested increasing this year's budget by roughly $325 million on its path to a world-class school system, Governor Hogan has only proposed $200 million of that number, which will certainly have Democrats looking to make up the $125 million difference. However, Governor Hogan cautioned lawmakers against unsustainable spending measures such as this as he prepares for any possible downturns in the economy, putting away in the state's reserves up to $1.3 billion. But he did include funding for state employees across the board to receive a 3% raise this year, including one union of the 5 that didn't successfully negotiate a deal with the Hogan administration. Each year, the state's unions negotiate the next year's wages with the governor, and while Governor Hogan reached agreements with 4 of the 5 unions, he couldn't come to an agreement with the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, otherwise known as AFSCME. The governor still gave increases to their union members, stating that the group's leadership continued to play divisive political games at the expense of their hard-working employees, but that he did not want to punish these hard-working men and women because of the failures of their paid political operatives. However, AFSCME representatives took a different approach to this standoff with the governor, stating that the union represents more than 20,000 employees, that the governor was trying to restrict them from communicating when negotiating their salary increases, denying them their First Amendment rights. The union has since filed an unfair labor practice complaint against the Hogan administration with the state's Labor Relations Board back in October, and recently revised it just last week. However, that has not prevented the governor from allowing their members to receive the same 3% increase like every other state employee will receive later this year. The governor also proposed $248 million in spending to combat Maryland's growing opioid addiction crisis, as stated in last week's Annapolis Report, along with a proposed $378 million therapeutic treatment center that will be attached to the Baltimore City Jail, run by the state, to include funding for treatment, housing, and counseling upon release from the jail facility. The administration has proposed $56.5 million in programs seeking to attract businesses in the federally designated Opportunity Zone program across the state, while also putting up to $1.4 million into the budget to hire 11 employees for a new office to investigate allegations of misconduct in local school districts. One such funding that appears to be lacking to certain elected officials, including the Senate president, is funding to combat crime in regions such as Baltimore City. As we discussed last week, the Hogan administration has proposed a comprehensive set of initiatives, including a strike force that will bring 200 officers from 16 different agencies together to tackle violent crime in the city of Baltimore. And it includes $50 million in grants for programs that serve victims of crime. However, Miller, the long-term state Senate president, believes that a mere $13 million to address crime in Baltimore was not nearly enough to eradicate crime in a city that has witnessed 300 plus homicides a year for the four past years, with as many police commissioners during those years to boot. Senate President Miller said that he wanted to see funding for a second police training academy at Coppin State University and hiring of 500 new city officers. He is quoted as saying, "When Baltimore City hurts, our entire state hurts. There is a major crime problem in Baltimore City, and that the mayor, Catherine Pugh, put forth her proposals, but the governor, for whatever reason, didn't fund the proposals in his budget, so we're going to make sure that they're included in ours." Now, of course, we heard Governor Hogan this week during his inaugural address attack the divisive politics that are being played in neighboring D.C. as Congress and the president remain at a standstill during what has become the nation's longest serving government shutdown. And while we still get to hear the governor's State of the State later this month on Wednesday, January 30th, which will certainly set forth his priorities and set the tone for the remaining 9.5 weeks in the legislative session, the inaugural address may have given a little snippet into what we can expect from the State of the State address to close out January. Last week, we saw a few pieces of legislation heard before the committees tasked with considering passage of such legislation, including Delegate Brooke Learman's bill to reform Baltimore City elections with either a ranked choice voting process or open primaries, which was heard before the House's Ways and Means Committee on Thursday. Now, it's unlikely that this bill will pass this session, but given that it's a Baltimore-specific bill, all eyes will be on the members of the city's House and Senate delegation as to if they consider approving such a controversial piece of legislation. Now, I personally don't believe that there is an appetite for Democrats to approve either of these measures, which would alter their current primary process. But as a huge supporter of open primaries, it would certainly be a welcoming surprise to see this measure passed in some form or fashion. Now, we want to make sure that we stay tuned for all the pressing legislation that are about to hit the floor. Of course, bills are being introduced. We'll have roughly about 2,500 bills in both chambers introduced before the deadline, which comes up in early February. But for now, we want to stay focused on exactly what's happening in the legislative process, and we'll give it to you here every week on the Annapolis Report. And remember, new promise begins with a new day. Therefore, the promise of tomorrow is greater than that of yesterday. I'll see you next week. The Annapolis Report is produced by Jason Rodriguez and brought to you by the DMV Daily Media Group, Maryland's leading podcast network, offering you a wide variety of informational podcasts and programs, including the award-winning daily program, the DMV Daily Radio Show, which airs Monday through Friday from 5 to 6:30 p.m. on dmvdaily.news. You can find out more information on this podcast, which is released every Monday through the end of the 90-day legislative session in Annapolis on April 2019, or on other podcasts and programs produced by DMV Daily by simply going to our website, www.dmvdaily.news, and going to the podcast link. Be sure to follow DMV Daily Radio on iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Google Play, or watch episodes of the DMV Daily Show on Facebook, Periscope, or YouTube at DMV Daily News. And you can donate to this independent news outlet by simply going to paypal.me/DMV Daily News.